Wait, getting rid of restrictions means no need for inspections. Restrictions? On buildup of force after an armistice, right. But why allow that? Because a final peace will send all foreign armies home. Got it. But hey, what if there is never a final peace? Aha! Yeah, okay. December 2nd, 1951. The two sides have agreed on a demarcation line for a hopeful armistice, though it's only valid the next 30 days. But still, that's great, huh? Though it brings a few things into the light. If they have a line ready for an armistice, are they still supposed to fight? And if so, to what end? To take territory if they have to later just give it up? Each question begets a slew of new questions. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the war in the field was pretty quiet, but there was still the ever-present issue for the UN side of fighting guerrilla troops behind the lines. There was a general uproar over a report released that the communist forces had butchered thousands of UN POWs, although it turns out there's not actually any evidence of that happening, and the Panmunjom Peace Talks continued with seeming progress made on Item 2, which was the proposal to set a demarcation line for an armistice along current line of contact, but with a 30-day time limit to conclude the rest of the agenda, or it would become invalid. Talks resume November 27th, and it looks like Item 2 is sorted. The agreement stated that both sides accepted the principle that the line of contact would become the military demarcation line, and that following completion of the armistice agreement, both sides would withdraw 2 kilometers to create a demilitarized zone. If the armistice were signed within 30 days, the line of contact already determined by UN and communist staff officers would become the demarcation line, regardless of changes dictated by the battle situation during the period. Ridgway made it clear his troops would continue fighting during the 30 days. Ridgway is UN Forces Commander Matt Ridgway. There's a new guy at the talks on the UN side this week. It's Howard Turner, who's recently been running US 13th Air Force in the Philippines, replacing Lawrence Craigie at the talks, who is returning to the States to be Deputy Chief of Staff of Research and Development at US Air Force Headquarters. Before they discuss Item 3 on the agenda, and I went over all the items last week, UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy says to save time when they get to Item 4, which is arrangements relating to POWs, they should go ahead and exchange the names and nationalities of all of the prisoners and the locations of all of the POW camps, so everyone could study them and get up to speed before the formal meetings about what to do with the POWs. Communist Chief Delegate Neidell says, sure, this is a good idea. And then they get down to business with Item 3, which is concrete arrangements for the realization of ceasefire and armistice in Korea, including the composition, authority, and functions of a supervising organization for carrying out the terms of a ceasefire and armistice. That is a mouthful. Neidell presents 5 principles here. 1. All armed forces cease all hostilities the day an armistice is signed. 2. Within 3 days, all armed forces must be withdrawn from the demilitarized zone. 3. Within 5 days, they should be withdrawn from coastal islands, coastal waters, and the rear areas of each side. 4. Each side must agree there will be no armed forces or actions in the DMZ. And 5. Each side would have an equal number of people designated to form an armistice committee. The committee would be responsible for the nuts and bolts of things and supervising future implementation of the agreement reached. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot to argue with here. However, Turner Joy does point out there are still a couple of important things left out. Starting a ceasefire and getting troops out of the demilitarized zone seems pretty straightforward, sure. But what they really need to do is come up with some way to reduce or eliminate the possibility of the war resuming. So those 5 points are just fine, but there should be a couple more points. Neither side should build up its military supplies, equipment, or personnel in Korea during the armistice, and restrictions should be placed upon the construction and rehabilitation of military facilities for offensive purposes. If both sides accepted these conditions, neither would acquire a significant advantage. To assure compliance with these limitations, Joy proposed that a supervisory organization with joint observer teams be established and given sufficient authority and freedom of movement to keep all Korea under surveillance. This does not fly with the other side. On the 28th, Nam-il fires back at this extension of conditions. With regard to restrictions on increase of forces, he says they believe that any final peaceful solution beyond a simple armistice for Korea involves a total withdrawal of foreign forces from the peninsula. And hey, the UN insists that there be a political conference after an armistice to make a final permanent peace, don't they? So any restriction or reduction of forces belongs at such a conference. As for these observer teams, they are completely unnecessary, because if there are no restrictions under just the armistice, then there's no need for any inspections. See? Getting rid of restrictions gets rid of inspections. Joy says, come on, guys, we're not going to talk about all foreign troops leaving now, and your 5-point plan is too limited in scope, is all I'm saying. You guys always talk about building a bridge to peace, and restrictions on armed force buildups after any armistice will really help with that. It'll show that people are committed to the armistice while waiting for a final peace. The main battle lines were now plainly discernible. Since the UN command enjoyed a military advantage in the air over the communists, it desired to maintain the status quo and preserve its superior air capability during the armistice period. Hence the UN insistence on no increase in military facilities, which, in essence, meant airfields. To make sure the enemy did not violate this principle required that its companion, inspection, be also included. The communists, on the other hand, were just as determined to oppose any restrictions upon their opportunity to strengthen their air capability during a truce. If they could avoid agreement upon this principle, there would be no need for inspections. Almost needless to say, this issue dominates the talks the rest of the week. On the 29th, the UN side argues that both sides, or either side, could reduce their forces in Korea when an armistice is signed if they want to. But since who knows how long an armistice would go on, it's very important for UN security that the military balance of power not be upset. The enemy delegates in rebuttal charged that the UN command was attempting to prevent the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Korea and to intervene in the internal affairs of the People's Republic. This was quickly denied by the UN command, which asserted that only airfields would be affected by the restrictions. Roads, railroads, and other facilities could be restored. Ridgway has been pretty adamant that with any armistice agreement, the UN must have the right of inspection to be able to see what the enemy is doing. Just as an immediate practical issue, enemy air power has been pretty obviously growing all autumn. Any air bases set up now or after a truce would pose a real threat to Japan should war with the Soviets break out. Since control of atomic energy became a thing, the right of inspection is also a thing, to him at least. Such a thing that he feels if the communist side does not agree to it, they should break off peace negotiations. He thinks around 40 joint teams, some permanently based in points of entry to the Korean peninsula, and some roving around, would suffice. The US government tells him to, for sure, present his position about inspection, but be prepared to modify it, and to even concede on aerial observation and photo recon if he absolutely must. However, they state very clearly, if the talks are broken off, the responsibility for that must lie with the communists and not UN command. He is not allowed to break them off. Ridgway protested the UN delegation had been ordered to accept a position more advantageous to the communists than the communists' own proposal. Ridgway was also disturbed at language in a Joint Chiefs of Staff message stating that it was not in the military interests of the United States to be tied up in Korea indefinitely. Any withdrawal from Korea within 18 months of an armistice, he said, would result in incalculable damage to the American position in the Far East and would be tantamount to a betrayal of the Korean people. They say that there is no thought of any sort of immediate withdrawal, but global reality might force some kind of phased withdrawal. They do promise no sudden abandonment of the South Koreans, but again stress their main point. They do not want the talks broken over the inspection issue. That's item 3, of course, but item 4 stuff, the POW stuff, is still simmering in the background. On November 28th, Ridgway turns his proposal for resolution of the POW issue into the Joint Chiefs. Before he enters into the actual nuts and bolts of repatriation, though, he wishes to insist on the names, serial numbers, and locations of all POWs held by the Chinese and North Koreans. After that, he will try for a one-for-one prisoner exchange, and not all for all, since the UN holds way more communist prisoners than they hold UN prisoners. If he succeeds in that, then they can hold back for last whichever prisoners they want to. If the other side refuses and insists on all for all, well, okay, he would agree to that. But of course, that would mean handing over a lot of guys they don't want to hand over. Enemy soldiers who in some way aided the UN, suspected war criminals, solid intelligence prospects. And what about those guys who, for various reasons, do not want to be sent back to Communist China or North Korea? The Joint Chiefs are still debating what to do with them. Torn between their natural concern for the safety of the UNC prisoners and their humanitarian desire not to force enemy prisoners to return to the communists, they could see no sure method of safeguarding both groups. They say to Ridgway, maybe he can get an agreement to have joint teams do a screening of each prisoner before release. And if they got some guy that said, hell no, I don't want to go back over there, wherever there is, then he could remain under his captor's jurisdiction. It doesn't seem like they think this is going to fly, though, since they tell Ridgway and Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett they really welcome any suggestions to try and somehow resolve this. And in the meantime, Ridgway should roll with his November 28th proposal. Something else happens on the 27th once the demarcation line is agreed upon. U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet tells his commanders to make sure every soldier knows hostilities will still continue until an actual armistice is signed. These are his instructions after that. 8th Army should clearly demonstrate a willingness to reach an agreement while preparing for offensive action if negotiations are unduly prolonged to this end. A willingness to reach an agreement will be demonstrated by reducing operations to the minimum essential to maintain present positions, regardless of the agreed-upon military demarcation line. Counterattacks to regain key territory lost to enemy assault will be the only offensive action taken unless otherwise directed by this headquarters. Every effort will be made to prevent unnecessary casualty. This basically ties 8th Army's actions to those of the enemy, and really amounts to a ceasefire should the enemy so desire, right? And let's be clear, small unit commanders do not want to risk their men's lives unless they really have to at this point. So when the war correspondents break the story of Van Fleet's instructions, they write, the ground fighting in Korea has come to a complete, though maybe temporary, but still a complete stop. This is kind of embarrassing to Washington, especially once the Associated Press releases this. UN troops on the Western Front were ordered to stop all offensive fire against the communists today and shoot only in self-defense. It's not true, and it gives the impression that Ridgway fears most, that the agreement on the line means the end of the fighting. The 29th, U.S. President Harry Truman, while vacationing in Key West, issues a statement that such is not the case. Ridgway publicly says, it seems 8th Army has assumed a function entirely outside its field of responsibility. And sure enough, on the 29th, the UN artillery begins to blast once again. 68 patrols are sent out, and attacks up to regiment size are repulsed that day. And that brings me to the end of this week of the war, with an actual breakthrough in the talks the demarcation line agreed to, but it seems whenever they solve one issue, there are 4 more popping up in the background. Oh, and this week, Major George Davis shoots down 2 planes during a fight in the skies when his fighter interceptor group runs into a few dozen enemy planes of several varieties. This gives him 5 kills and makes him an ace. But an ace for the second time, since he had 7 aerial victories in World War II. He is the first man to be an ace in both wars. The news reports about the virtual ceasefire that comes after Van Fleet's instructions sort of ensure that, to at least some extent, policy will be to follow what they always say, that hostilities will continue until an armistice is actually signed. But here's the thing. Once UN command has agreed to a line and the 30-day deadline to sort out all the other items on the agenda. They are recognizing there are not going to be any large-scale or even medium-scale operations then unless the communist side breaks off the negotiations. As long as everyone is discussing and debating, it's not going to happen. I'm talking about on the ground, because that would involve sustaining possibly heavy casualties in taking territory that would likely have to be just given up. In the air and at sea, it's different. The UN has enough supremacy that casualties there can be kept low, whatever the case. The winter, the frozen Korean winter that lies ahead, promises to be one full of boredom and frustration for the men on the ground, should an agreement not come soon. But you know, bored is better than dead. But I'll be here all winter long, should the war continue until the spring, to bring you this coverage, which I can do thanks to the Time Ghost Army. It is the army that allows us to do all of our productions. You too should join the army to be part of our thrilling adventures, and you can do that at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Eric Johnson is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.